our student population each year had been diminishing. And it got to a point where you literally didn't see people on campus walking even in between class times. And it was sort of very demoralizing. And as you can imagine, as is with any institution, you have to have a certain number of bodies to be able to pay the bills. And so you have to have X number of people that are paying a proportion of their tuition to be able to pay the bills so that we can buy materials, equipment, heat the buildings, shovel the walks in the wintertime, buy internet access, get computers, all kinds of equipment and technological advancements.
It was because I wanted to go to a women's college, so it was, again, affordable and single-sex. I went to a single-sex high school in middle school, so about 5 years of single-sex education, and then wanted to go to a women's college, so that's why I picked it. And the campus is gorgeous, so that was another factor.
Everyone knew it was coming, but nobody wanted it to happen. Everyone wondered if it could be stopped. Perhaps this was inevitable. It was like watching the ivy-covered stone walls crumble and fall, not over years, but overnight. Wells College was going to admit men for the first time in its history. Nothing would ever be the same. Wells College was founded in 1868 by Henry Wells, the founder of American Express. Wells started out as a finishing school for the wives of the men who went to the neighboring university, Cornell. Both institutions overlook scenic Cayuga Lake. Cornell is in the bustling village of Ithaca, and Wells is down the road in the sleepy, enchanting little town of Aurora. Eventually, Wells became known as a strong liberal arts institution for women. It was of the same caliber as schools like Vassar, Sarah Lawrence, Wellesley, and Mills.
On the last day of classes, the students, well, seniors wake up earlier and they do a little bit of joyful drinking in the morning, and then all the fire alarms are actually set off at 6 a.m. and that's to summon all the students to the sycamore to dance around the sycamore that morning. And so we all dance around, circle it. The sycamore is a big tree in front of the main building of Wells. It's very iconic to the Wells culture, being held up by cables so it doesn't fall apart as it's, aging. But yeah, so beautiful, huge tree. Think about probably 300 to 400 on-campus students dancing around it. And, each different class is called up and, has their own little time to go into the center near the tree and party. And then at the end, the juniors present roses to the seniors, which is nice. And then the seniors line up and kiss Minerva's feet, which is the statue of Minerva at the front of the Wells building. So we all kiss her feet, take our pictures with her, present roses to Minerva as well. And then champagne breakfast happens, which is just fun. I mean, it's seniors getting champagne with their breakfast. So it's fun and it's a good, and the last day of classes is never taken too seriously. So it's always a fun little piece of the tradition at Wells.
For 136 years, Wells was a single-sex women's college. Young women who studied here spent their college careers surrounded by other women. Only a handful of professors and college administrators were men. As a single-sex institution, Wells women assumed all leadership roles that at co-ed colleges through the 19th and most of the 20th centuries would normally have gone to men. Women did not have to compete in the classroom. Gender discrimination was virtually non-existent. Women could work and thrive in a way not possible at a co-ed institution. As a result, Wells grew into a long history of producing female graduates who took on prominent roles in society at a time when those kinds of roles were rare. Well-respected doctors, lawyers, and business leaders came out of the small college. Among some of the notable alumni are Frances Folsom Cleveland, the wife of President Grover Cleveland, and Pleasant Thiel Rowland, founder of the American Doll Company. For over 100 years, Wells and the women who went there flourished.
Almost got to the point where you'd forget you were at a women's college. I mean, we would be sitting in the dining hall sometimes and look around, and I'd realize, oh my gosh, there's only women here, you know. And so, but I think, you know, the leadership positions obviously all have to be filled by women. Your faculty take you very seriously. There's no, you know, competing in the classroom. There's no, you know, gender discrimination in that regard.
Once in a while, a Cornell student would come, and there was a male Cornell student who wanted to take a creative writing class of mine, and I was very happy to have him. Very nice, talented young man. And I told my students he would be coming, and there was practically a mutiny. And they, you know, I was worried that when he came, they would be extremely unfriendly to him. And they just said they couldn't have a regular class with a male student.
By the 1970s, single-sex colleges began to struggle. Only 3% of graduating high school seniors would even consider a single-sex institution. The feminist movement of the late 60s and early 70s was opening more and more doors for women at co-ed colleges across the country. Women's-only institutions were for the first time being regarded as old-fashioned and even obsolete. To survive, some of these colleges began to admit men. Traditional single-sex strongholds, Pembroke, Douglas, and William Smith, merged with their male counterparts. In addition, small, independent, private liberal arts colleges were also finding it hard to compete as money poured into state colleges throughout the 60s and 70s. Wells, however, resisted the multitude of pressures to change with the times.
One is that it's hard to be a small private college, and women's college at the time too. When Wells was a women's college, there were less than 3% of graduating high school women would consider a women's college, so would even consider it. So you're dealing with a small pool, you know, to begin with. Liberal arts colleges, especially in New York State, are really struggling.
Through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, enrollment continued to drop. By the year 2000, enrollment at Wells was barely over 200 full-time students. With such low numbers, Wells was in deep financial trouble.
I mean, I remember working in the president's office as a student during the summer, and there was a magazine on the desk that had come in with the mail, and it was about Trinity College in Vermont closing, and that had closed, I think, in 2000. But it was a big article on the closing of that college, and it was a women's college, you know, in Vermont. And I looked at that, and I said to Lisa Ryerson at the time, "Oh my gosh, this is so sad. I'm so glad that's not going to happen here." And she's going, "Well, you know, we hope not."
It was necessary at the time, or at least we're pretty sure it was. There were only 264 students on campus when that decision was made. But for at least 10 or 15 years, there was discussion of possibly going co-ed, and every time it was raised as an issue, it was very controversial and ended up being dropped.
We had tried a variety of other methods to increase our student enrollment, one of which was momentarily quite successful. We drastically reduced our tuition. I think it was by something like 30%. And for the next year or two, we got a pretty good bump in our student population. But then it diminished again.
Finally, on October 2nd, 2004, in a momentous decision, the Board of Trustees decided that Wells would go co-ed. The decision caused an uproar among students and alumni.
I think one of the hardest things I had to do was stand on the stage in the auditorium in Phipps in front of the students to announce what our decision was. So when we had voted to go co-ed, we were sitting in the Henry Wells room, which is in the library, and we couldn't see the students. The board had met in the German culture room, which was across the hall beforehand, but students could line up on the driveway and we could see them. So they had moved us, for that meeting into this room where you couldn't see students out of the windows. When we walked into the library that day, the students were lined up. There's these stairs that go across a ravine that have seats and everything on them, and the students were lined up, with signs, and we had to kind of walk the gauntlet, for lack of a better term, through there, and you could hear them chanting.
The trustees were going to officially make their decision. Students formed a line, like a gauntlet, that they had to pass through. So the trustees actually had to walk through a long line of students with black armbands or signs, or I think they wore gags, black gags, because they were said that their point of view was not being heard. So it was dramatic.
I think I recall that there were some students that kind of camped in the administration building for a while. And again, the administration was very open-minded to that, and as you probably have seen in other kinds of student protests, in other areas of the country, things can get really rough, and they call in law enforcement to arrest students and drag them out of buildings where they're, a sit-in protest, but that wasn't the case here.
It was the most heart-wrenching day in the history of Wells. The board met in the German culture room of the library, away from the swarming crowd of protesting students. To announce their decision to the college community, the board members had to march across a bridge, down a path, and through the back door of the Macmillan Building to Phipps Auditorium. As the board made their way, they were engulfed by an endless sea of students wearing black gags across their mouths, a symbol of their belief that their voices were not heard in the co-ed decision. It was a gauntlet of student and alumni protesters. Almost everyone at Wells was against the change.
And so it was just incredibly difficult. And then having to leave and meet them in Phipps, and all of the board members stood on the stage in Phipps, and it was announced that we had voted to go co-ed, and there was just this kind of collective gasp and almost like a cry.
The protests continued after the announcement was made and lasted several weeks. Students set up tents and occupied the campus for what was to be a peaceful protest. The administration made no effort to move the students, even though classes had come to a halt, and Macmillan Hall, one of the main academic buildings, had become the hub of the occupation. It was a scene reminiscent of classic images from the civil rights movement. TV news crews came, and Wells' decision made national headlines. Despite the extensive coverage and national publicity, the protests had no effect. The board had made its decision, and the decision was final. No matter how articulate, no matter how passionate, the students could not stop Wells from going co-ed. In a letter of reflection on the co-ed decision, Andrew Yanko, the first male to interview with the Wells admissions office, wrote this: While they weren't exactly floodgates, the doors to men were open. In the fall of 2005, the first group of male students were admitted to Wells. The environment on the little campus in Aurora was about to change.
I think that having a women-centered environment is very important, and at least to have that option for women to choose from, which sadly it's harder and harder to find those spaces for women in academic settings. When I applied to Wells, it was still advertised as women-centered. I wonder if I could find the pamphlet that existed at that point and open it up, and even though it was co-ed, it said women-centered academic institution. And that was a seller for me. I knew that that was along the lines of what I wanted, even though it was no longer a single-sex institution. But I wanted that women-centered component, and that was very much taken away, especially during my junior and senior years.
As Wells made the transition into a co-ed institution, in addition to attracting male students, it began to attract a different kind of female student.
The first freshmen, women who came were different from what they had been as Wells students, and that the new freshman women came to Wells because it was co-ed, and there was none of the sense of, the idea of I'm going to a women's college, that will be central to my experience. And so that was one of the big things so there was a lot of bitterness among the upper class women about the freshman women who came, and they said they were just a different group. They were looking for something different. So there was really a strong sense of betrayal there.
The change in student life at Wells grew more palpable with each freshman class. Long-standing traditions continued, but the students who participated in them were different, and new traditions started to emerge.
To me, a lot of the traditions, I wasn't so much a participant as I was a planner, so I was really trying to make sure they went smoothly. I was very proud of the haunted hayride our freshman year, because it was a tradition that had kind of fallen by the wayside for a while and was kind of half-assed, and we were meticulous, and it was awesome. So that was really fun. I guess reviving some of those traditions, like May Day is one. The first day of May, we still do the very traditional ribbon maypole, women dressed in all white and white roses, and it had been kind of half done for a number of years before we took it over, but we repainted the maypole and put new ribbons on it and enforced a strict dress code and ordered extra flowers, and we had a court and live fiddle music and snacks and printed menu. Like, it was a whole thing.
I think our core values are staying the same, but we are expanding in other areas that are not considered to be traditionally liberal arts kinds of areas to try to increase our student population to become more attractive for post graduation job opportunities. So I think we will always keep the ideals of women's rights, feminism, and a lot of those areas, and with the addition of males on campus, what better place to teach those ideals to the opposite sex?
It definitely has value, and I'm not opposed to it in any way. It is not for me. I believe that we should learn in an environment which is relatable to and conducive to interactions in the greater world, and the world is a patchwork of different faces and genders and sexualities and races, and that I wanted my education to be a microcosm of that, in any education that I receive in the future.
In 2003, Wells College existed in its own world, a world of single-sex education that was deeply cherished for over 130 years. For many students and alumni, the decision in 2004 was unwelcome and the subsequent years of transition were agonizing. But going co-ed was not a measure taken for the sake of upheaving years of tradition. It was imposed as an effort to save the college from closing its doors forever. Now, both men and women are welcome to enroll at Wells, and today's Wellsians are given the opportunity to participate in the same traditions and events that the first class of graduates created so many years ago. The core philosophies and most of the traditions at Wells are still the same as in the year that the college was founded. But Wells today is not the same as it once was. What was once a robust school for women, ahead of its time, is now known as a rigorous coeducational liberal arts college. But Wells today has a future. Enrollment is slowly climbing to a point of sustainability. Under new leadership, new initiatives and improvements are taking hold, and students are able to thrive and succeed within the same classrooms that produced generations of confident thinkers before them. The doors of the college remain open, and they are now open wider than ever before. Because of that, Wells is still in a position to provide an education for an extraordinary life.